Hello everybody, my name is Spencer Walsh, and on today's episode of Hidden History, we have a young West African indigenous general and military man. A fight to free an oppressed African former French colony from decades of brutal rule, and the incredible backlash that followed. That is right, ladies and gentlemen. Today we will be taking you to Burkina Faso, or as it was called prior to 1983, Upper Volta, or French Upper Volta, to really get into what is the incredible story of Thomas Sankara and really his kind of unique personal character and his rule in Burkina Faso / Upper Volta. You know, I personally prefer to call it Burkina Faso. But yeah, we'll get into the whole story with that. It's a very incredible, important, and powerful story. And, you know, definitely another thing, another kind of example of really what this whole season of Hidden History has been about. But we start the story today in French Upper Volta. Obviously the current Burkina Faso, a smaller but resource-rich country in the west of Africa. It had a period as French Upper Volta, then Burkina Faso. The French conquered the place at the turn of the 20th century and crushed any resistance from the indigenous Mossi tribe that was the kind of bigger force, the most dominant force of the area, kind of as far as any kind of indigenous tribes. Where this is, you're talking about, late 1800s into the early 1900s. We got the scramble for Africa, all that stuff, kind of very, very similar to what we talked about. The same kind of dynamics that we talked about with the Belgians in the Congo. Kind of, that was actually just up north. Excuse me, that it was the south. I got to flip my geography there mixed up. But anyway, the point remains that it was a pretty rough ride, just like for so many people in Africa. Again, this was not really the most common or the most uncommon occurrence for a lot of people, a lot of colonized Africans at this time, and it was really just viewed by obviously to varying degrees depending on whatever country you happen to kind of represent and stand with, but it was really pretty clear that the government of the French was really only in there for one purpose and for one purpose only, which was to conquer and to extract profit, essentially by any means necessary. There were obviously very brutal discriminatory practices. African kids, for example, were not allowed to ride bikes or pick fruit, or their parents would be thrown in jail. These privileges were obviously only reserved for the colonial kids. The French imposed their own slanted pro-colonist justice system and divided the region arbitrarily into several administrative regions, kind of purely for their profit. They changed the boundaries a lot of times. They put, people, who used to live in the kind of the same community and kind of the same, group of people doing the same kind of shared customs and things like that. They were kind of instantly put under a new kind of administrative region just because it was more convenient and more profitable for the French to do that at that time. There were also obviously French forced labor practices throughout the colonial period that were led by French overseers, which were mainly focused on cotton production and other cash crops. This top-down structure really did kind of destroy a lot of the indigenous culture, and really was pretty common throughout Africa. Obviously saw this to a pretty extensive and pretty horrific degree in our episode about the Congo as well. 2 episodes back. So it really created a deeply rooted exploitative system in the country. And, it really became clear for a lot of times, like this was, a big part of colonial success was to, really slant the culture, slant the society, and destroy any bonds of community that these tribes may have had, because their bonds between each other, in terms of shared language, that was obviously banned, and all these shared customs of respect and the way the community functioned were completely destroyed by these French overseers who were really there to force profit, force production. They cut down a ton of trees in the area at the time, just really just there to extract as many resources as they possibly can. And this is West Africa. You got Mali, you got Niger, you got tons of Nigeria. Not too kind of in that region. Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, these are all areas that were really pretty brutally hit by the French, pretty much from Niger or Niger, whatever, if you want to go about it the French way, in Nigeria, all the way up through Algeria, as we talked about in the last episode with Charles de Gaulle, and that was kind of on the eastern side of things, but then Mauritania, Senegal, Gambia in the west, that was really, they essentially occupied probably a quarter of Africa, and it was one of the most resource-rich parts of Africa. This is the French that we are talking about here. Obviously, though, after World War II, there was immense pressure to decolonize throughout Africa and a push for self-determination. The French leaders knew they couldn't keep everything locked down, so they essentially conceded self-governance, but kind of under something called the French Community, which is essentially, letting the French colonies go as on their own, but, still having some very strong ties. French, for example, French officials still in the country, tributes paid, land exploited, things like that. That was still going on from about 1958 until 1960. This movement, though, was really pushed by a guy named Maurice Yameogo and his movement, the UDV, which is called the Upper Voltaic Democratic Movement. Yameogo was a nationalist who was a former member of the colonial administration, and he was somebody who really was quite a visionary and quite a ruthless guy, but he was a visionary really for himself. And the vision he saw for himself was at the top of his country, and that included making sure that the French were out of the way. And he really did was seize on a big kind of nationalist current going on at the time. Tons of African countries were getting their independence around the late 50s, early 60s, as the kind of self-determination craze really kicked into high gear, not just with France, although it was in large parts with France, but all throughout Africa, British making some concessions, some of the smaller kind of Central European countries making some concessions as well in terms of their holds over Africa. Almost 100 years on from the scramble for Africa in the late 1880s. Unsurprisingly, though, Yameogo was given the keys to the French. He was given the keys really by the French, who were saying, okay, we can trust you. You're going to kind of be a good intermediary leader, because he was, prime minister towards the end of the French government. He was their kind of colonial, native representative of the kind of French government in its last legs. So he had already, he was an ambitious guy. He was a good orator, and he was very, very good politically. So that made him able to kind of work his way up through the ranks, kind of charm the French Voltains, I guess you call it, Voltites at the time. The people, the French officials in that area, they put him in charge of the government. It was a big kind of, they were much more into local rule with Burkina Faso rather than, home rule. France really not really controlling too much, and really leaving a lot to local tribes, which kind of did create this whole political class of people, of native Africans, or Burkina Faso, Burkinabes is the kind of the new term for it, but I guess you could call it that now, because it's I think people know, listeners know what I'm talking about here. But anyway, that was the kind of key point. Because he was able to, really get himself in there, given the keys, kind of as a trusted representative by the French, and that happened in 1960. So he was an ambitious guy. He was a power-hungry guy. So what did he do as soon as he was kind of freed from French control or kind of French oversight? He essentially purged all his opponents from the UDV and made, at that time, again, Upper Volta, a one-party state. Meanwhile, a few years back in French Upper Volta, one of the future icons in Burkinabe history, Thomas Sankara was born to two indigenous parents in the city of Yako. Sankara, really from birth, was a pretty ambitious student. He was excelling at math, history, and French, and he was also a very religious guy in his youth. His priest and his parents almost got him to go to seminary school, but he ended up joining the military. The military had just overthrown Yamego at the time, who had become not much of a surprise, very despotic, deeply unpopular, and was kind of very easily replaceable. It would be the first in a country that unfortunately would be plagued by coups, as their last coup that they had again was here in 2022, which is kind of horrific to think about, given that this we're talking about here was 60, 70 years ago at this point in time. Anyway, so he joined the military. It was a very kind of common thing because the military was very popular because they just got rid of Yamaego, who was, again, very much of a despot. So everyone was like, hey, why don't we go join the military? It seems like a very worthwhile thing to do. They're doing great things for our country. They're setting our country up for success. They will be the people that kind of get us back on track and, kind of being a real respected nation. Also, on a kind of a more practical basis, and it certainly makes sense, it was the cheapest way to get an education. And that was something that, especially a higher education. And that was something that Sankara, who, as I said, was very, very much a student at heart. He was someone who by all accounts in his youth, a big, big time hunger for learning. That was something that he was able to get pretty quickly. So he joins, and by the way, they replaced he was replaced. The coup was led by Sangoulé Lamizana, who was the army chief of staff who overthrew the original guy who overthrew the French, Yamaogo. So you have Lamizana in charge, but meanwhile, Sankara, while this all was going on, was at a Madagascar military academy. It was actually being taught by civilian professors at the time, which is kind of an interesting choice for, kind of a surprisingly progressive choice for a military government, recently a colonialist state, to have military, have really put a lot of effort into kind of military education and making sure that, the officers, because he was in officer school for a certain amount of time, that they had some really deep kind of worldly understanding. And it was a civilian professor who taught him, and he recognized, the professor, that Sankara was very ambitious, very knowledgeable, had this big, deep thirst for learning. So he kind of took him aside with some of the other students that he felt were kind of more exceptional, and started to talk about the events of the world, talking about neocolonialism, socialism, communism, imperialism, and all the various African liberation movements at the time, as Lumumba was happening right around this time. And just the basic struggle for, Pan-Africanism was also discussed, like this idea that Africa should come together. It was really here where Sankara begins to get his understanding of the world, kind of his political awakening of, okay, this is my position in a very unfair, very oppressed world. And it kind of seems like I'm almost at the bottom of the totem pole here. This was something he also, reading Marx and Lenin at the time, in this military academy, really did change a lot of his views. And I think it's kind of clear. You kind of see him through the research, through looking at this. You can kind of see him begin to understand that, and begin to form his future beliefs here. And that, okay, I'm here in Africa, former colonial state. And Sankara was living at a time where it was incredible, it was a scary time because a lot of these movements, all these rebellions were being, gunned down by seemingly overbearing and really, in actuality, overbearing and completely overpowerful Western powers that were, coming in, squashing these movements like bugs. But really, all this at the same time, there was movements happening. Kwame Nkrumah, bringing all the African leaders together. The Third World Movement was really developing at the time to say, we can stand up to not just the First World, but also the Second World and the Soviet Union, and really just kind of build this non-aligned movement of people, uniting to ensure, almost uniting to ensure independence for each other, making sure that there was control over all the various movements, over control over, all the, various countries had control over their economies, their natural resources. That was a very kind of important thing that was talked about in these meetings because it was an important topic of discussion in a lot of these classrooms. I could picture, this late night discussion, Sankara, maybe a few students talking with a professor. We're here in Africa. What do we do to stop this colonial kind of reassertion of colonialism by the West? And how can we break their control? And how can we ensure independence for ourselves and our economies and our political culture and just general society? And then how can we ensure that we keep them out in the long term and become self-sufficient? I think this was really kind of a big moment where he was able to gain his real desire for self-sufficiency. Anyway, these discussions, they really influenced his political bent, but he also interestingly learned about efficient crop production and how to make sure that people can be fed in an efficient way from the earth. He rose to prominence as an officer around that time, but coming out of the school, he returned to Upper Volta in 1974 and fought a border war with Mali at the time. It was kind of a few year war, and apparently he did a very, very good job. He received wide recognition for the fact that he was very brave, fought very bravely, did very well, etc. But he later, interestingly, kind of a sign that his political consciousness was growing, that he thought that the war was unjust and useless, essentially kind of believing, why are we fighting amongst ourselves? Why are we having these border skirmishes when there are so many greater enemies out there? Because one thing about Thomas Sankara is he was not afraid to use force. He was a military man through and through. So after that, gaining prominence, he was kind of began his celebrity status right here from this war. And that is when he met another officer and befriended another officer by the name of Blaise Compaoré. They formed a communist group with Blaise Compaoré and other officers at the time, and they were really rising up the ranks of the Upper Volta, the newly independent Upper Volta military. After Lamazana was deposed by yet another military man, Sai Zerbo, Sankara was appointed to serve in his government as Minister of Information and advocated for a free press, which led to increasing government scrutiny and the publishing of scandals in even state-owned newspapers. I think that's another one of the things you can really trace throughout the Sankara career is this dude was nothing if not completely, standing by his principles. He was principled through and through, even when it may hurt him, may get him in trouble with the boss. He was saying, this is what I believe. I'm going to follow through on it, even if it inconveniences me, causes me personal pain. I'm going to do it because it's the right thing to do. And he did not back down on it. He resigned, actually, over mistreatment of laborers and the labor movement by the Zerbo government. And he didn't really have to, wait around too long before that government was overthrown in another coup in 1982 that brought about Major Dr. Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo.
Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo.
There we go. That. Ouedraogo. There we go. Excuse me. I apologize too if there's any African listeners out there who are just kind of probably cringing at the moment. But yeah, so he was appointed as prime minister, actually, of the Ouedraogo government. And there he really relentlessly lobbied for progressive reforms, kind of was a thorn in their side. So much so that when the French ambassador came to visit, I think it's not the craziest thing to assume that some words got passed and some words got said between the French ambassador and the then leader, Baptiste Ouedraogo, who appointed Sankara because he was dismissed and placed Sankara under house arrest. He was a military man, he was very authoritarian, and he locked down Sankara put him under house arrest, which essentially caused massive protests in the capital city of Ouagadougou. People flooded the streets for days because Sankara at the time was very, very popular, known for his principles, and his principles were also very, very popular. And it also caused some dissatisfaction among the younger officers of the military, so much so that his good friend Blaise Compaoré rallied yet another coup. This time, though, it was for Sankara, as he was now freed and made president of the country as kind of the martyr from the previous government. He had a pretty high stature as PM. He was fired. He was cast out for advocating for the people, and a lot. He was very, very popular in the state of Upper Volta itself at the time. So he was really kind of the natural choice to lead this new people's government, this revolution that was really much, kind of inspired by Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. He's kind of, I think, relatively reductively has been compared to the kind of called the African Che Guevara, but really is so much more than that. And no disrespect either to Che, he did a lot of very, very important things as well. They're all their own people. But anyway, he was very, very popular at the time. He really represented a young, free Africa. And it was really kind of it was a revolution. It was a message of hope. And he was going to come in there and he was really going to change things. He was good looking. He was an athlete. He rode his bike everywhere. He was also an accomplished guitarist as well. He actually ended up composing his own country's national anthem. He also commanded respect by frequently appearing in army attire. If you look up any picture of him right now, you'll probably see him in his little red cap and camo army attire. He was about that life, though. There's no other way of putting it. He was also inspired by Jerry Rawlings of Ghana, as well as Fidel and Che. And the first thing he did was drop that, frankly, pretty bad Upper Volta name. And the Volta River is just a river in Africa, saying your country is the upper part of this river. Not really very enchanting. He changed it to Burkina Faso, which means land of the uncorruptible or upright people, which is a pretty cool name, if you ask me. Sankara then launched into massive policy reform. So when Sankara got into policy, he really got into it. He started by launching a mass 2.5 million people plus vaccination campaign to eliminate polio, meningitis, and measles, and cut infant mortality in half in just 4 years in office. Really kind of an impressive record of, It's kind of goes along with the line of, if they wanted to, they would. Things like that, they can be done when there's the will, when there are, the resources that are there. And it was very, very clear Thomas Sankara was going to be different. He was going to capitalize on this situation. Not, maybe to the powers that be wasn't as objectionable, but, it kind of gets more objectionable to people like France, to people like the United States, as things go on. Just to give you a sense of how run down and how underdeveloped and just how purely extractive and exploitive France and probably all these other countries have made their colonies, just the way these systems were built. And it's kind of very similar to the way the South was after the Civil War, just completely undeveloped. They had to build schools, they had to build hospitals, really for the first time, because they just did not exist. It was not kind of a society. It was just essentially a feudal society in the South for leading up till the Reconstruction period, when they had to really just do all this stuff. Kind of the same way, they literally had to build factories to build houses in the first place. They had to build brick factories in order to make enough brick to build houses. The basic level infrastructure was just not built at all by the French. They didn't care about the people. They viewed the people as complete human tools for extraction, for profit, and who cares, honestly, what happens to them. But Sankara was really the first leader to do that. He built these factories. He built tons and tons of homes for people. He planted, actually, which really was a big problem due to the kind of urban slums that were becoming more and more problematic in Burkina Faso at the time. He also built a vast road and railroad network connecting all the regions of the country, just showing that, again, the infrastructure there by the French just was not there. He also instituted a vast education program, which increased literacy rate from 13 to 73% in just a few years. And all this, by the way, was done critically, very critically, with complete local control over both natural resources, including land, because, he really redistributed a lot, but we'll get to that in a second. But also, he did this all with no foreign aid, because he believed that would make him subservient to Western forces. He wanted to be completely self-sufficient as an African country, and had a plan to back it up, redistributing land from colonial landlords and the tribal chiefs who collaborated with them. And this kind of revitalization, and really just vitalization, there was no to kind of go back to, of the peasants, of the far bulk, the quote-unquote working class, the proletariat, to use kind of a Marxist type of term there, of Burkina Faso's population, was incredibly influential. Not only was he incredibly popular, the quality of life for Burkina Fasoans or Burkinabes really improved, but he was also able to triple the production of wheat, which made Burkina Faso a fully food self-sufficient country. He said, "The person who feeds you imposes his will on you." And this really was a big quote that kind of sums up a lot of Thomas Sankara's foreign policy. And he, again, he tried to push this kind of mindset to a lot of other countries as well, maybe not as successfully. But he said, the person who feeds you, and this could mean economically, this could mean literally feeds, provides you resources, gives you security, they are going to impose their will on you one way or the other. You're going to have to pay the price. And that was something that Thomas Sankara knew could lead to a complete lack or loss of all the gains that he was planning on making for Burkina Faso and the population they already had made. And it was really, really incredible that stuff. You built railroads, educated people, fed people in incredible ways. Like that kind of stuff, and the basic effort, the really successful effort, at least for the time he was in office, to push Burkina Faso to be a completely self-reliant country was a incredibly smart and incredibly necessary move that really, I think, establishes him as unique to a lot of the people that we've talked about in Hidden History season 4, whatever the hell this season is. Like they've tried a lot, and pretty much everyone tries to be self-sufficient, recognizes that they couldn't, really rely on the West for a lot of their key resources, but all of them are able to make the transition, and not very few of them, if any, are able to really make that transition successfully and produce just incredible results with it. It's really remarkable stuff. Anyway, so yeah, it was clamping down kind of on government corruption as well, which had been rampant through not just the French, but through all those, military leaders that had come before Sankara in Burkina Faso. He made the ministers drive Renaults instead of Mercedes, reduced the salaries of all public officials, including his own, and forbade the use of chauffeurs in first-class airline trips. He made it mandatory to pay 1 month's salary to public works projects for all civil servants, the very well-off civil servants, the bureaucrats in the government. He even refused to use AC due to the fact that it was inaccessible to the public. He was sitting there in his office sweating because, hey, if one man's got it, or if one man doesn't got it, which, by the way, it was obviously the vast majority of the country didn't have AC, and it's in the middle of Africa here. He was not going to go sitting in his office being completely chill, being completely kind of unbothered, and not being in touch with the people. So, incredibly, not only is it a, ethical, moral thing to do that won him a lot of praise, it also helped keep him in touch. It also, reminded him every day, all these things, that this is how my people live, and I better do my best to represent them. He required all public servants to wear native-made clothing, not a single thread from America or Europe, he said. He also really was a big supporter of women's rights, really more than anyone in Africa or really pretty much anywhere around the world at the time. He also outlawed female genital mutilation, forced marriages, and polygamy. He was the first African leader to appoint females to high government positions and encourage women in the workforce, and granted pregnancy leave, for really the first time definitely in African history, and damn sure that wasn't a thing in America, at least to the extent that it should be at the time as well. I mean, we're talking about 70s, 80s here. Well, again, it wasn't the 1950s, but in America at least, but it was not the most progressive time for women as well. He also notably refused to have a cult of personality created around himself. He didn't want his portrait being hung due to the fact that the movement he really believed wasn't centered around him. He's like, hey, there's 7 million Thomas Sankaras. I'm not special. I'm just coordinating here. Kind of the not me, us sentiment from the Bernie Sanders campaign, but on a much more relevant, much more practical, and much more effective scale, because he was actually doing it in a country that needed it, arguably way, because we need it pretty bad, but way, way more than we did. So, he, again, was beginning to also form friendships with other anti-imperialist leaders at the time, trying to get them all kind of off foreign aid, which he viewed as a colonial tentacle. But the elite of Burkina Faso were unhappy with the lack of access they had to public funds and their souring relationships with their Western friends. So, in October 1987, Sankara was going to a cabinet meeting, which, by the way, everywhere he went, which is really pretty incredible. He was big, obviously, on women's rights, women's employment, really making women equal in Burkina Faso society. So he decided to just get all women bodyguards and have them follow him around on his favorite mode of transportation, the motorcycle. So everywhere he went, there'd just be these women kind of loaded out with rifles, I'm assuming, and all these kind of heavy machinery just going around with him everywhere that he went. But one day, it really started to matter. In October of 1987, specifically the 15th of October, 1987, Sankara was going to a cabinet meeting when he ducked down, hearing gunshots. The assassins entered the building, and according to a survivor, Sankara originally was crouched down when he heard the shots, but eventually realized and said, quote, "Hey, it's me that they want." He surrendered the gunman with his hands in the air. The gunmen, seeing their target, executed him on the spot. It later came out that the hit squad was led by Blaise Compaoré, his closest friend and the man who helped install him into power. Compaoré took control of the country after intense pressure from not just Burkina Faso elites, but, at least in his telling, the West, and the fact that more and more they were losing trust, faith, and most importantly, their economic ties in the country of Burkina Faso. Sankara and his promising reign ended that day. Compaoré, who was sentenced to life in prison just a few years ago, as he was sentenced again to life in prison for his time and his involvement in the Sankara attacks in 2022, in April of 2022, but was incredibly welcomed back to Ouagadougou, which is obviously the capital of Burkina Faso, for a meeting about stopping radical Islamic jihadi terror. He had to be sentenced in absentia because the Ivory Coast, which is a nation that is still ruled, again, by a military dictatorship with close ties to their former French overlords to this day, had been kind of posting him up, setting him up with a sweet mansion. So that's his kind of a punishment, or maybe not so punishment, maybe more like a reward for doing what he did to Sankara and really snuffing out any chance at a just Burkinabe society. Compaoré, though, in the immediate aftermath, took control of the country and immediately reversed nationalizations, such as the nationalization of land, and instantly reapplied for foreign aid, which again was one of the biggest keys of Sankara's reign, is that he hated the foreign aid. Obviously, Compaoré immediately applied for that, helped his formerly kind of a colonialist friends get back in their good graces with their Western counterparts, sent that Western money flowing in, put Burkina Faso back in the clutches of the IMF and the World Bank, and tried also to destroy his friend's legacy in any way that he could, via both propaganda, calling him as calling Sankara a kind of messianic figure who wanted to take power for himself and all that, and politics through obviously many policy changes, reversing all the reforms, and essentially sending Burkina Faso right back to its pre-Sankara days of authoritarian military men ruling with an iron fist. But many people would say that Compaoré failed in this effort. Unable to stamp out the widespread admiration for Sankara, Compaoré's government recognized him as a national hero in 1991. Outside of Burkina Faso, too, his uncompromising integrity and tragic circumstances of his downfall have earned Sankara a popularity that endures today. A monument dedicated to Sankara and other national heroes was inaugurated as recently as 2010, and Sankara's grave site remains very constantly visited. On the 20th anniversary of his death in 2007, Sankara's exiled widow, Mariam, returned to Burkina Faso for the first time and was met by thousands as she laid flowers at her husband's resting place. The spirit of Sankara was again in the air 7 years later, when a popular uprising successfully ousted Compaoré from a government after 27 years in power, pretty much ruling nonstop since he overthrew his best friend and helped him get gunned down outside of that cabinet meeting. Sankara's deep popularity still to this day in Burkina Faso still comes out in even things as seemingly trivial as the fashion, with the danfani, a traditional fabric commonly associated with Sankarism, worn widely in the aftermath of the 2014 coup, has seen a spike in popularity, especially after the end of the Compaoré regime. The sentence handed to Compaoré is a culmination of a decades-long struggle for justice, however bittersweet it may be. Sankara joins the ranks of African visionaries such as Kwame Nkrumah and Patrice Lumumba, and the idea of a unified Africa free from neo-colonial control drifts slowly into the territory of what could have been. Burkina Faso is plagued by political instability, as evidenced by the coup that took place in January of 2022, and the continued battling against radical Islamic jihadism, and much more instability. What's more, the French government refuses to acknowledge playing a role in the 1987 coup and keeps classified documents pertaining to Sankara's assassination under lock and key. French President Macron pledged the declassification of these documents in 2017, but they have yet to materialize. Compaoré and his accomplices may have been served justice, at least in absentia, but the colonial oppressors that facilitated his coup have yet to have been held accountable. Amid this big picture, however, there is a sliver of optimism. The 2014 uprising demonstrates that Sankara may be dead, but the dream of an independent Burkina Faso, where its people stand proudly, with their backs unbent, lives on. As Sankara himself said before his assassination, quote, "Ideals cannot be killed. Ideas never die." Blaise Compaoré's sentence is one step towards justice, but the liberation of Africa from the hands of neo-colonialism and a reckoning brought to the old colonial powers can provide the real justice Sankara deserves. And honestly, the next time that guy comes to the country, lock him the hell up. Lock Blaise Compaoré up and throw away the key. I'm sorry. Anyway, on that note, thank you so much for listening today. We will be back next week.